Just 48 hours ago, the U.S. government, the Trump administration, said that top Russian military intelligence officers orchestrated a massive hack to affect the U.S. election. How much do you want President Trump to try to hold Putin accountable for that?
I think really we mistake our response if we think it's about accountability from the Russians. They're another country. They're going to spy on us. They do spy on us. They're going to interfere in our elections. We also do the same. Dov Levin at Carnegie Mellon studied this over about a 50-year period in the last century and found 81 times that the U.S. interfered in other countries' elections. So we all do it. What we need to do is make sure our electoral process is protected. And I think because this has gotten partisan and it's all about partisan politics, we've forgotten that really the most important thing is the integrity of our election. And there are things we can do and things that I've advocated, making sure it's decentralized all the way down to the precinct level, making sure we don't store all the data in one place, even for a state, and that there's a backup way that someone in the precinct can say 2,000 people signed in. This was the vote tally I sent to headquarters. There's a lot of ways we can back up our election. Advertising and things like that, it's tricky. Can we restrict the Russians? We might be able to in some ways, but I think in the bottom line, we've wanted the Russians to admit it. They're not going to admit it the same way we're not going to admit that we were involved in the Ukrainian elections or in the Russian elections. So all countries that can spy do, all countries that want to interfere in elections and have the ability to, they try.
It sounds as though you are saying that the United States has done the equivalent of what the Russians did in the 2016 election, and it might sound to some viewers that you're offering that statement as an excuse for what the Russians did.
No, what I would say is it's not morally equivalent, but I think in their mind it is. And I think it's important to know in your adversary's mind the way they perceive things. I do think that they react to our interference in both their elections. They were one of the reasons they really didn't like Hillary Clinton is they found her responsible for some of the activity by the U.S. in their elections under the Obama administration. So I'm not saying
but surely,
it's morally
Senator Paul,
equivalent.
the United States has never done. The United States has never done what Russia did. Yeah. Okay, go on. I'm sorry.
I'm not saying they're equivalent or morally equivalent, but I am saying that this is the way the Russians respond. So if you want to know how we have better diplomacy or better reactions, we have to know their response. But it's not just interference in elections that I think has caused this nationalism in Russia. Also, I think part of the reason is we promised them when James Baker, at the end, when Germany reunified, we promised them that we wouldn't go 1 inch eastward of Germany with NATO. And we've crept up on the borders, and we still have neocons in both parties who want Ukraine and Georgia to be in NATO. That's very, very provocative, and it has stimulated and encouraged nationalism in Russia. George Kennan predicted this in 1998 when we still had Yeltsin and Russia was still coming in our direction. He said, if you push NATO up against Russia's borders, nationalism will arise and their militaristic tendencies will increase, and you may get someone like a Putin, basically. George Kennan predicted the rise of Putin in 1998. And so we have to understand that for every action we have, there is a reaction. And it's a big mistake for us not to say that we're morally equivalent or anything Russia does is justified, but if we don't realize that everything we do has a reaction, we're not going to be very good at understanding and trying to have peace in our world.
I want to get to NATO in a second, but just to underline this point about what the United States should do in response to the Russian election interference. In a new interview just this morning, President Trump said he, quote, hadn't thought of asking Putin to extradite those 12 Russian military intelligence officers. Do you think President Trump should ask for the extradition when they meet tomorrow?
I think it'd be a moot point. I don't think Russia's sending anyone back over here for trial, the same way we wouldn't send anybody over there for trial. No country with any sovereignty or sense of sovereignty is sending anybody to another country for trial. I think we have to protect ourselves. So because we waste time saying, well, Putin needs to admit this and apologize, he's not going to admit that he did it, and we can't take on face value anything they tell us. We have to assume, and if we have proof that they did it, which it sounds like we did, we should now spend our time protecting ourselves instead of sort of having this witch hunt on the president. If the president was involved, by all means, put the information forward. There is no evidence so far of the president's involvement at all in this, so I think we need to be done with this so we can start actually protecting our elections from foreign countries.
Well, you just called this a witch hunt, but if it were not for this probe, if it were not for Robert Mueller, the American people would not know about the Russian military intelligence officers who are hacking American emails, stealing voter information, releasing stolen information to influence the election. I'm not sure how you can call it a witch hunt. Isn't it a good thing that this probe has continued?
I would say that this is a Department of Justice investigation and that would still have ensued in either way. I wish President Obama had been more aggressive in pursuing it during President Obama's term, but I think the Department of Justice can get to the bottom of this without sort of a special counsel. I think the Mueller investigation, the problem with these special counsels is exactly what happened in the Starr investigation, and that is that they run far afield of it. People are threatened with life in prison for tax evasion. And so what happens is you end up spending years and years and millions of dollars. And I think that in the end, it's too enormous of a governmental power. Can you imagine, if every businessman or woman in the U.S., if we went back through 30 years history of them and nitpicked every one of their tax returns, what we could do to every individual if the full power of the government came after them? And then if we took every individual that worked for them and threatened them with life in prison if they had made a tax violation, I think we'd live in a world that nobody would really like or appreciate at that point. So I'm very much against these special counsels, but I do think the Department of Justice would have investigated the Russians, and I think indicting these officers that were hacking the elections is a good thing.
This week, the Senate, I want to talk about NATO now because you brought it up. This week, the Senate voted 97-2 in favor of a motion that supports the NATO alliance. This was a non-binding motion expressing the Senate's support for NATO, calling on negotiators to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to NATO. You were one of the two in the 97-2. You voted against it. There is consensus that NATO has served an essential role in stabilizing Europe, which ultimately has prevented the United States to need to take military action and to also check Russian aggression. You talked about how NATO has moved closer and closer towards the Russian border. A lot of experts say that's because Russia has continued to expand and take territory in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Georgia. Do you support NATO?
I think it's sort of chicken and the egg. Which happens first, either NATO's expansion or Russia's pushing back or vice versa? I will say that when you look at NATO, what I voted against was an ironclad commitment to defend any nation in NATO, and they also said that they want an open door policy in NATO to admit any aspirant. So I think that is very foolhardy to say we're going to defend any country in the world that wants to be in NATO, and we're inviting any country that meets the requirements to come into NATO. That is a recipe for disaster, and no thinking foreign policy expert would have voted for this if they realized that we're having an open-ended commitment to whoever wants to join NATO and an ironclad commitment. I think it dilutes the value of NATO. NATO has had historic achievements and has been part of what was deterrence to Russia. But the interesting thing now is that European forces are 13 times bigger than Russian forces. European plus U.S. forces are probably 30 times bigger than Russia's forces. So right now, there's a disproportionate advantage to the West with NATO. I'm not saying we disband NATO, but I don't think we should have an open door policy. I think, for example, going to war over putting Albania in or putting Montenegro in, or particularly putting Ukraine or Georgia in, would be a disaster. And that's what the neoconservatives are advocating for. They have been agitating for years, and I've been blocking them, is putting Georgia in. Russia's in Georgia right now. For better or worse, they are there. It is right on their border. We would be at war with Russia right now if Georgia were in NATO. So people need to think through these things before they get so eager to rattle their sabers about, wanting to have a confrontation with Russia. We spent 70 years trying not to have a confrontation.
I just think there are a lot of people out there who would be surprised to hear a sitting United States senator describe Russia versus NATO in terms of confrontation and expansion as a chicken or egg proposition, given the fact that NATO protects sovereign countries while allowing them to remain sovereign, while Russia invades other countries and takes over those countries. I don't think it's chicken or the egg.
Well, what I would say is that there were people, probably the greatest diplomat of the last century was George Kennan, and he did predict as NATO expanded that you would incite militaristic tendencies and nationalism in Russia. I'm not justifying Russia's aggression in Ukraine or in Georgia. I'm not saying they're equivalent. I am saying, though, that the provocation of pushing NATO forward after we promised, James Baker promised Gorbachev in 1990 when Germany unified that we would not go, the West would not go 1 inch beyond Germany. And yet, a couple years later, under the Clinton administration, we kept pushing. And so for every action that we put out there, there is a reaction. And I think we need to think this through. And it's not a moral equivalency. It's not justifying Russia's behavior, but it is realizing that from Russia's perspective, they see NATO expansion as a threat, and that part of their militarism and part of their nationalism may be inherent to the tides of the current century there, but it's also in reaction to policy from the West as well.
Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, we thank you for your time as always, sir. Good to see you.